Sometimes we may be tempted to think of the direction of mission effort as from the West to the rest. But did you know that God is raising up more and more workers from countries that were once considered mission fields? Mission workers increasingly are from everywhere, going to everywhere. This comes with both blessings and challenges, and this is our topic today as we discuss the globalization of missions.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a podcast for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. Here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us as we continue to discover how to participate in global missions more effectively. I'm your host, Mags, and today we'll consider something that's greatly enriching the church's effort to engage the unreached. We'll be unpacking the globalization of missions with the help of Don Parsons of Send International. Just before we get to the interview, we'd like to share with you this mission resource.
Do you have the Joshua Project app? Download this free app from Google Play or Apple Store and start using it today. The Joshua Project app provides you with a daily summary of an unreached people group and how you can be praying for the work happening among them. Download the Joshua Project app and join the team praying that God's kingdom would come to every tribe, tongue, and nation. And now, here's our interview with today's expert guest.
Hi again, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's expert interview. Our guest is Don Parsons, and I'll add that this is a treat for me because Don is not only a guest, but a colleague in the same agency that I serve with, and also a longtime personal friend. I think we met maybe in about 1998, Don, thereabouts?
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah, 1998.
When you first arrived in Kiev, that's right.
Yeah, back in Kiev. And as a matter of fact, we lived in your apartment, if you remember, while you were back in Canada for a period of time for family needs. Mm-hmm. And so our first meeting of you was probably seeing your picture sitting in that apartment while we were living in it, getting adjusted to life in Kiev.
Wow. That was 100 years ago, wasn't it?
It sure feels that way.
Wow. For those of you that haven't had a chance to meet Don, he and his wife Esther, and they have 4 children. They served over a decade in Europe and in Central Asia. They were engaged in church planting and discipleship and in the mobilization of national believers into global missions. He now serves in the international office as the Director of Globalization for Send International. This role focuses on the expansion of Send's contingent of non-North American workers through education and training and strategic development. And I say, Don, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mags. It's great to be here, be able to have this time to talk to you and to talk to your listeners.
Just before we jump into our main topic today, would you just take a minute, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to be passionate about God's mission?
My wife, Esther, and I, we were married nearly 25 years ago, and we immediately had a drive and a passion towards missions. We took a short-term missions trip soon after we were married. And fast forward about 5 years from that point, and we found ourselves moving to Kiev, Ukraine, which is, as we already said, where you and I met. We were involved in language school while we were there. And after language school, got involved in a church plant, and God miraculously opened doors. I know our organization, one of the things that we focused on when we went into Ukraine is to see Ukrainians with a passion to take God's glory to the nations. And as you already mentioned, we got involved in mobilizing Ukrainian workers, or mobilizing national workers, and that was Ukrainian workers. And it was amazing to watch how God opened doors for the Ukrainians to go outside to Russia, to Central Asia, and to places well beyond that.
I'm looking forward to getting into this topic today, the globalization of missions from everywhere to everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I thought it would be helpful to begin just by defining a few key terms here. I don't want our vocabulary to get in the way. And so this term, first of all, globalization. In business and in economics, globalization is defined as the process of international integration arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. So we acknowledge that globalization is a worldwide phenomenon that has been underway for some time already, and it's accelerating. When we speak of the context of global missions, what do we mean by globalization?
Well, it's a topic that I get very, very excited about. I like to describe it really in the practical terms that we see happening around us. You know, it was just over a century ago that 95% or more of the Christian world lived in the West. They lived in Europe, they lived in the United States. Fast forward to today, and the vast majority of believers around the world aren't in the West, but they're in places like Africa, in corners of Asia like Korea and the Philippines, in Latin America, Central, South America. Take a country like Guatemala, a place that has estimates well north of 25% evangelical. And a century ago, you would be lucky to have been able to find an evangelical believer anywhere around the streets of that Catholic country. Mm-hmm. Amazing what God is doing.
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful transition to the other two terms I wanted to get in at the beginning here. One is the Western world. When we talk about the Western world, we mean Europe and North America. Sometimes Australia is included in there as well. But those countries that have, over the last few centuries, typically been the senders of the gospel news, the senders of mission workers. The other term is the majority world. We're using the term the majority world referring to those areas of the world collectively that are not the West, and who over the last couple of centuries have been the receivers of the gospel news, but especially in the 20th century and now continuing in the 21st century, you mentioned those increased numbers, and there are healthy churches in increasing numbers throughout the majority world. That's the dynamic that we want to talk about here. So why is globalization an important factor when we talk about global missions?
Well, to continue what I was talking about previously, just imagine Guatemala. Like I said, 25, some consider to be 50% evangelical. Well, those believers, the church continues to grow. The churches are being planted all over the country. And now there's people in that country that are saying, "Here am I, send me." You know, when Jesus left the Great Commission, when he told his disciples, when he told us, his followers, to go and be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth, he was talking to all believers. And that today means talking to Guatemalans. That means Brazilians. That means Indians. That means Filipinos. And they're saying, "Here am I, send me." And they're going to nations all over the world, and God opens up doors for them in places where, frankly, Mags, you and I might have a hard time either getting into or having a hard time connecting with the peoples in those places, or just might find it more difficult, where their cultural affinity or closeness or similarities open up doors for them.
Don, let's spend a minute unpacking some of this capacity that majority world workers are bringing into the modern mission movement. You mentioned access, for example.
Yes. I know of countries in the Middle East that would be closed, at least largely closed, to access for you and myself to get in. There are relationships with some of the countries in places like the Middle East, with countries in Latin America, for example. And those relationships, the government relationships, are very cordial. And what that has led to is open access, travel between countries, requirements for residencies. And you've got people going from Latin America that are able to travel to the Middle East, able to live in the Middle East, able to set up businesses there, and able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ in a place that is very difficult to get in otherwise for other peoples.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other capacities that these workers are bringing?
One of the many things that I see as real benefits for a Latin American, or let's say a Filipino, that wants to go to a Muslim country or some of the other closed countries of the world, is they bring a cultural, deep understanding of family and relationship They understand the importance of spending time with individuals, with families, in ways that you and I struggle to understand as well. And they go to these countries where they have very similar cultural bents. In the Muslim world, they're some of the warmest, most welcoming, family-oriented, community-oriented people. And sometimes from the West, in our very individualistic societies, we struggle to adapt to those cultures when we go to take the gospel. Many have done it and they've done it effectively. But when a Latino or a Filipino goes into a place like that to take the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's amazing the kind of open doors that they have just because they understand family, they understand community, the richness of togetherness in great ways.
Could we say it's going to enrich it to have both and? We'd like Western workers and workers from the majority world?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? It's a biblical principle at work. Take John 17. Jesus prayed. In his high priestly prayer, he prayed for us, he prayed for his disciples, and he prayed for those that would believe through those that were listening at that time. That's us. And what did he pray for? He prayed for our oneness. He prayed for unity. Now, I don't just take that to mean unity within the local church, but unity within the church worldwide, the evangelical church worldwide. And he said, when they are one, when they are working together, when they are loving each other, when they are supporting each other, when they're crying together, when they're laughing together, it says right in John 17, Jesus' words, then the world will know that God has sent his son. And you have multicultural teams. You have teams around the world of Canadians and Americans, Germans, Guatemalans, Filipinos, Ukrainians, working side by side. They're taking the gospel and they're moving forward with it. And Mags, it's amazing to me to listen and to hear and to personally have experienced what those multicultural teams bring. You go to a place like Central Asia, for example, and they look at culture and religion, they tie the two together. If I am a Russian, I am an Orthodox believer. Right. If I am an American, then I am a Christian. If I am Central Asian, then I am Muslim. Now, all of a sudden, you have people from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different cultures, and they're saying the same thing. They're preaching the same message. It's a universal gospel that's for all peoples in all nations. And a multicultural team can express that in rich ways that monocultural teams or singular cultural teams can't.
I wonder, with the positives that come there and the positive demonstration of unity and diversity, it's going to come with some challenges too, I expect.
Absolutely. Multicultural teams are filled with challenges. It takes a lot of work. Mags, we understand from our days in Kiev that sometimes just working on a team, not you and I, of course, but working on a team together can bring its challenges. It can bring its difficulties because, we have different upbringing, we have different families, we have different, just our backgrounds. Now, multiply that or magnify that many times over, and you have someone coming from a poor village in Guatemala, and another person coming from the barrio or the village in the Philippines, another one coming from Germany, and the others coming from the United States. Their understanding of simple words like team, or their simple words like leader, or the ways that they make decisions are very, very different one from another. So what you have to do is you have to take time up front to really define your terms, to talk through if we get into a crisis situation and we don't understand each other, we are going to take the time to discuss these things, to talk them through, to understand what those differences are, and not make assumptions just because someone says one thing and you understood it this way, but in your culture that meant something totally different. You're going to take the time to understand those things. That's just one example.
Don, you're talking about some of the dynamics in teams. I wonder if we could move that to the individuals or families of missionaries coming from the majority world. What are some of the challenges that face them as they desire to be involved in global mission?
Well, as you can well imagine, finances is a huge challenge, a huge hurdle. some of the places where these missionaries are coming from, they might be making just a couple $100 a month, or $2,000-3,000 in a given year is the average salary. And even if they're going to a country somewhere around the world where the cost of living is much lower and it's a less advanced country, nonetheless, the economic challenges of going from Latin America or from the Philippines or some other location, from Africa, they can sometimes be overwhelming just from an economic perspective for them. Sometimes language can be a real struggle. Honestly, you and I are communicating right now in the English language. That's obvious. And all of our listeners are listening in English. English is a global language. In a globalized world, as you might call it, really English is a foundation. But what if English isn't your heart language, or the language that you would prefer to communicate in, and you're a Spanish speaker, or you're from another country in Asia with an Asian language, and you have no one on your team that really speaks that heart language that you speak? So it's sometimes loneliness impacts non-North Americans, impacts majority world workers in very profound ways. Can I go on to say, though, Mags, those very negative things that I just told you about, those difficult things, can be the greatest asset that a majority world believer brings to the missions endeavor. Dependence upon God when finances are very difficult to come by. I recently, well, actually it wasn't that recently, a number of years ago now that I'm thinking about it, I heard a story about a believer from Africa who was talking to a Western worker. And the believer from Africa asked the Westerner, he asked a question, have you ever been in a position where you have a sick child and you don't have the money or the means to take that child to the hospital or to a doctor? The hospital that you know about is too far away anyway, and you don't have the money to buy medicine that might be necessary. And all you can do is kneel next to the bed of that child and pray to God to heal that child, to protect that child, and you just cry out to God. And he asked that Westerner, he said, have you ever been in that position? And the Westerner said, no, I've never been there. And our brother from the majority world said, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. I would rather be dependent upon God completely, to trust him for all of my needs, including needs like this.
Great story of dependence, and a lesson that we can learn, especially those of us that come from a higher GDP country. Well, what are some of the other things that we can learn, Don, from majority world workers and from these new agencies?
The newer agencies that are beginning to emerge in the majority world, they don't have a lot of infrastructure. They don't have a track record. They don't have the bookkeepers all in place and all of the HR policies, human resource policies, and whatever else you want to list out. And some might look at that and think that that's strictly a negative thing. But I think that those very facts help give them a nimbleness, an ability to just move forward by faith, to just trust God. We don't have all of these things that kind of sometimes can hold us back, the majority world believer would say, and they just move forward to carry out the Great Commission, and they're not looking to the right or to the left or looking behind them. They're just moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, Don, we've been talking about some of the things that we can learn from majority world workers. What are some of the things that we're able to offer from our Western experience to these new workers and agencies?
This past summer, we had the opportunity to host a dear brother from Latin America, from Central America specifically. And he was up here at our international office just to talk about the opportunities that exist in the Latin American church and the Latin American world for sending out workers. And he said, we want to send out 50 new workers in the next 3 to 5 years. And we think that number is probably too low, just their group alone. But he said, we really could use some assistance. There's lots of things that we're new at. And he went on to describe his view of how we in the West can help the majority world. He says, we need you to be a Barnabas. We want to partner with you. And as I look at that picture, I think about a Barnabas as you've got Paul and John Mark out in front, and the Barnabas type personality stands to the back, ready to catch them if they fall, encouraging them, pushing them forward gently, graciously, helping them, ready. And really, I think that that's what we can bring. We have lots of experience in pre-field training. We have lots of experience in how to care for a missionary on home service, how to debrief them well. We have a lot of experience in how to support missions and how to help a church to support their missionary. And they would like us to share those experiences. And that's my job. That's what I desire to do, to go to places in the majority world to help those missions and the churches in those areas to understand what it takes to send, support, in every way, a worker.
One of the audiences for this podcast is local church leaders and those involved in missions committees. What advice do you have to offer to them as they learn about partnering more with majority world workers and maybe majority world agencies?
I think one of the first things that we can do in partnering is, of course, to pray, to understand and to be thankful to God for what he is doing in the world, to take the mindset or to remove the mindset from ourselves that says that missions is from the West to the rest. It's a figure of speech I heard a couple of years ago, but it's really truly from all nations to all nations, or from at least many nations to all nations, and to change our mindset and to be thankful to God for what he is doing in the world. The gospel is being taken to the nations in amazing new ways because the gospel is being taken to the nations by believers from all over the world. And for us to understand that and for us to stand behind that is a powerful thing. Now, how can we specifically and concretely stand behind that as well, Mags, you asked? One of the ways we can do that is through financial support. There are workers from the majority world who could use our help in order to get to Europe and to serve and minister and do their church planting and outreach in those areas. Mm-hmm. And so for us to be able to come alongside them with some financial assistance is one way we can help.
But underlying that ability to help financially seems an attitudinal adjustment. That's what I heard you saying, that there's an underlying attitude that needs to be reconsidered here in the West.
Yeah. Missions and outreach to the nations, it's all of us together. It's not, we are not somehow better than any believer from any nation. If we all have and share the same spirit, then we all have the capacity to be able to do amazing things for God.
And if we can match up some of the ready potential in people with some of the financial resources of the West, that would also be a promising linkage, a promising partnership that we'll need to navigate through wisely. We've had another episode where we talk about financial partnerships, another episode of the podcast, I mean. So I'd refer a listener to the episode with Mary Letterleitner about that. Well, Don, as we begin to wind down, I want to ask about Send International. We have something called the Global Worker Initiative. Tell us just a bit about that.
Sure. If you remember me mentioning it earlier, the average incomes in some of the countries that these workers are coming from is just a couple $100 a month. And for a local church, individuals to support that missionary and to provide all of the things that they will need in order to serve in Asia or to serve in Europe or Central Asia, it's extremely difficult. So the Global Worker Initiative, what it does is it provides assistance in ministry expenses, travel expenses, helping to provide for conferences and member care opportunities for these workers.
Just to be clear then, not all the money is coming from the West.
No, not all the money is coming from the West. As a matter of fact, we encourage local churches in Latin America or in Asia to financially come behind their workers We even require them or desire for them to support their missionaries' salary needs 100%. We're only trying to help with some of those extra expenses that are typical and normal for a missionary, for a worker to go out to the field.
So it's a middle ground. You're not saying that all the money has to come from their sending nation, nor are you saying all the money will come from the West, but it's a combined partnership together.
That is correct.
Well, Don, we have just scratched on the surface of a very big topic, of course. If our listeners would like to learn more about majority world missions and this globalization movement, what resources do you recommend?
Well, one of the best books that I have read on the topic of multicultural leadership and teaming is by an author named James Pluteman. It's called Leading Across Cultures. Another book that I recommend, now this one doesn't really answer your question regarding globalization and mission, but it relates more so to the interface or interaction between workers from different nations. It's a secular book. It's called The Culture Map, and it's by Aaron Meyer, but it's filled with practical stories about different cultures and how they interface one with another.
Don, if any of our listeners would like to learn more or connect with you on this topic, how can they get in touch with you?
Oh, I'd be glad to interact with anyone who'd be interested. My email address would be the easiest way. It's dparsons@send.org.
As we draw to a close, I wonder if you would just share from your experience some occasion where you've really seen these pieces fit together and you've seen it work.
When I think about what God is doing in the world over the last century and up to today, our organization, Send International, began 70 years ago or so. It's just a little bit less. We had missionaries who went to the Philippines, and they found very few believers there. Fast forward to today, and there's some 10, 12% evangelical believers in the Philippines. And those believers are saying, "Here am I, send me." About 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Thailand, and I was on the border with some of the other nations in the far north. I was visiting with a family, a Filipino family. They were missionaries. They had responded to the call, and they had come about 3-4 years previous to that, and they came with their own 3 children to work with children on the street. Well, one day they got a phone call. "Please come." And they went to the border, and they said, "We have a problem." And they were staring at their contact, their friend, and with that person was 7 children, ages 5, 6, 7 years old. And they said, "All of these children have lost their parents. And if we don't do something to help these children, they're going to end up in slavery." And as you can well imagine, these missionaries, they didn't hesitate, not for a second. They took those children. They took them into their own home. They had 3 of their own kids. Now they had 10. Over the course of the next year, they took 3 more, 13 children. And when I was visiting there, they gathered around me, and they had already shared the gospel with these children, had been instilling the word of God into their lives, and they had even taught them some English. They taught them some English praise songs. And they stood around these children. The children stood around me, and they said, "Sing Uncle Don a song." And they sang a song that's familiar to many of us. "He's my Prince of Peace, and I will live my life for him." And I heard these kids singing, and I looked at them, and I couldn't help but imagine where they would have been had these Filipino missionaries not come and shared the gospel with them. That's what God is doing in globalization and mission, taking the gospel to many nations. And now those nations are responding and taking the gospel to other nations and to other unreached people groups.
We hope you found today's interview to be both informative and inspiring. If you missed anything or would like to check out the resources or links mentioned during the interview, you can find the show notes we've prepared at our website, globalmissionspodcast.com. You can also use the website or our Facebook page to suggest a particular topic or expert you'd like to hear featured on this program. The Global Missions Podcast is co-sponsored by the Jaffrey Centre for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada. Thanks for listening in. I'm your host, Mags, and I invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.